Arizona Territory, 1878. The kind of dry heat that cracked wagon wheels and lips alike had settled over the land. And by the time Grace, Whitlow reached the town of Ash Bluff, her heart had already turned to something sharp and cold. She stepped down from the stagecoach in a faded blue dress, boots dusty from the long ride and eyes that held no softness. Not anymore, not since Owen. She had left Kansas with $27, a broken promise sealed inside her, and 2 children who kept asking when their father would come back. She never did answer them. "Letty, stay close to your brother," she said, her voice flat as she lifted her youngest down from the coach. Letty, barely 6, wrapped her arms around Grace's skirt. Louis, 8, and Sirius held tight to a battered satchel that carried everything they owned. Ash Bluff was not much, just a row of sunburnt buildings, one saloon, a general store, and a livery that smelled of horses and heat. Grace had no plan beyond getting away from the house Owen left her behind in, along with their bank account and a neighbor's wife. She had sworn off love the day she found the letter. She had not cried. She had packed, sold what she could, and walked away. "Ma'am." A deep voice stopped her in her tracks. She turned. A man stood beside a chestnut horse, tall, broad in the shoulders, his shirt rolled up at the sleeves. His hat shadowed his face, but his eyes were alert, kind. "You all right?" he asked. "I am," she said quickly. "We do not need help." "I did not ask if you needed help," he said. "Just if you were all right." Grace narrowed her eyes. "We are fine." "Good," he said, not pushing. He tipped his hat, then turned to tie his horse to the post outside the general store. She watched him go, jaw tight. She had met men like him before, smooth words, soft looks. She would not fall for it again. The room they took above the livery was small but clean. Grace made the bed for the children, pulled a quilt from her trunk, and stared out the window as the sun set. She had no job, no friends, and barely enough coin to last 2 weeks. But she was free. The next morning she asked around for work. The general store had nothing. The seamstress was not hiring. The schoolhouse needed a teacher, but the pay was poor and the position already spoken for. By the end of the day, her feet ached and her pride sat bruised under her ribs. "Excuse me," she turned. The cowboy from before stood behind her. He looked younger up close than she had first thought, maybe 30. His eyes were gray, steady, and he carried himself like someone who knew how to wait. "I heard you were looking for work. I have a ranch just east of town. My housekeeper left last week and the place needs keeping." She stiffened. "You offering charity?" "No," he said. "I am offering a job." "Name is Holden Sawyer." She hesitated. "Grace Whitlow, you have children?" he asked, nodding toward the boy beside her. "Yes, 2. I got room, not much, but enough." She looked him over. He did not leer, he did not push, and she was out of options. "All right," she said, "I will work." "But I am not here for anything else." He met her gaze. "I did not ask for anything else." They moved to the ranch 3 days later. It was a weathered house with a wraparound porch, a barn, and open land that stretched to the horizon. Holden kept to himself, rode out at dawn, worked hard, and came back with dust on his boots and no complaints. He never asked questions. Never pried. Grace scrubbed the floors, washed dishes, cooked meals. The children took to the quiet life easily. Letty followed the chickens. Louis asked to ride with Holden. Grace did not stop him. One evening after supper, she caught Holden watching her from the porch as she hung laundry. The breeze lifted her hair off her neck. She turned to him. "You staring at something in particular?" He leaned back in the chair, just thinking. "About what?" He paused. "How someone can be so strong and still look like they are carrying the whole world on their back." She blinked. "Do not say things like that." "Why not?" "Because I do not need them. Words like that from men." He stood. "Then I will show you instead." "What does that mean?" He stepped off the porch, slow and deliberate. "You said you are not here for anything else. I respect that. But there is a difference between being alone and being left behind. I'm not the kind who walks away." Grace felt something twist in her chest. "You do not know me." "I know enough to see you have been hurt," he said, "and I am not going to hurt you." She crossed her arms. "You are a cowboy." You ride out every day, you could leave tomorrow. I could, he said, but I will not, she looked away. I do not believe in love anymore, he nodded, calm and quiet. That is fine. I will show you what it truly means if you let me. Nothing in his voice was rushed. Nothing in his eyes held pity. He turned and walked back inside as the wind picked up around them. That night, Grace sat on the edge of her bed long after the children had fallen asleep. She touched the letter Owen had written her, the only thing she had kept. She did not cry. She folded it, slipped it into the fire, and watched it burn. Holden never pushed. He let her work, let her be, but he always came back. And something inside her, something she thought was gone for good, started to flicker like a flame not quite out. The days shaped themselves around the rhythms of the land dust rising behind Holden's horse each morning, the low creak of the windmill at dusk, and the soft clatter of dishes being dried by Grace's hands in the evening light. The work was steady, the quiet honest. And though she still watched him with wary eyes, something in her had begun to ease, not trust, not yet, but the bracing tension of survival had softened its grip. One afternoon in late September, Grace stood behind the house shelling beans while Letty sat nearby drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. The sun was lower now, the heat tapering off earlier in the day. A hawk circled high above the pasture. Grace's fingers moved with practiced speed, but her thoughts drifted. You always work that fast. Holden's voice came from behind her. She didn't turn. Idle hands make for empty plates. He stepped beside her, holding a strip of leather with a broken buckle. You know anything about mending tack? I can sew near anything, she said, but I've never stitched leather. He offered it to her anyway. Thought maybe you'd want to try, I can show you. She hesitated before wiping her palms on her apron and taking the strap. All right. They sat beneath the cottonwood behind the barn. Holden set out the tools on a flat stone, all thread coated in wax, needle thick as her pinky. His touch was sure but patient as he guided her hands. You've done this a long time, she said, threading the needle with care. Since I was a boy, my father made me fix what I broke. Mine said girls had no business with tools. He glanced at her. Seems he underestimated you. She looked up, surprised. You don't say much like that. He met her gaze. I say what's true. They worked in silence for a while, save for the scrape of the needle through leather and the rustle of leaves overhead. When the strap was done, she ran her fingers along the seam. Not bad, she said. He grinned. Not bad at all. As twilight settled in, they stood to go. Grace dusted off her skirt, then paused. What happened to her? Who? Your housekeeper. She married a store clerk in Bisbee, he said. Wrote me a note left before sunup. Said she wanted Walls and company. Grace nodded. This place is quiet. It is, he agreed, but not lonely. Not anymore. She didn't answer. Just turned and walked back toward the house, the stitched strap still in her hand. That night, after the children had gone to bed, she lingered on the porch longer than usual. The lantern burned low at her side. Holden sat across from her, boots crossed at the ankle, hat resting beside him. I came here because I didn't know where else to go, she said, not looking at him. I figured. I thought leaving would be the hardest part. It wasn't. It was realizing I'd stayed too long. Holden didn't speak. He waited. I kept thinking I'd failed as a wife, as a mother, that I should have made things work. You didn't fail, he said quietly. Someone else did. The words settled deep inside her. She looked over at him. Why haven't you married? He shrugged. Didn't meet anyone who made it seem worth the risk. Until now, her breath caught, but he didn't press. Just stood, took up his hat, and went inside without another word. The next morning, she found a small bundle on the kitchen table, a set of leather needles, wax thread, and a folded scrap of hide. No note. Grace touched the tools and let her fingers rest there a moment. Later that week, she began making a pouch for Louis's marbles. The stitches were uneven, but she worked late into the evening by lamplight, her brow furrowed in quiet focus. Holden passed through the kitchen once, refilling his coffee. He paused at the doorway, eyes on her work, then said only, "You'll make something fine out of that." She didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth lifted just once. Each day after, he found small excuses to teach her things: how to spot signs of sickness in the cattle, how to use a whetstone, how to tell by wind if a storm was coming. He never hovered, just offered, then stepped back. And Grace, without realizing, began to stay closer when he spoke, to ask questions that weren't just about chores. She even laughed once when he fell off the porch trying to swat a horsefly the size of his thumb. He laughed too, sprawled in the dirt, hat askew. It wasn't much, but it was real. One evening, as they watched the sky turn orange behind the hills, she said, "You keep showing me things." "Why?" Holden tipped his head. "Because you're worth the time. And because I don't want you to leave." She studied him, the way the sunset touched the lines at his eyes, the way he didn't flinch under her scrutiny. "I haven't decided if I'll stay, I know. But I haven't thought about leaving in a while." That he didn't answer. He just nodded once and looked out over the land as if it too was listening. The wind shifted. The scent of rain drifted in from the west. They sat there as the sky darkened, neither breaking the silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because, for the first time in a long while, they didn't need to fill it. October brought a shift in the air, not just in the cooling wind moving through the cottonwoods, but in the quiet understanding that had begun to thread its way between Holden and Grace. Days shortened and the work turned heavier. Hauling wood for the stove, digging out the root cellar, bringing in the last of the squash before frost could take it. Grace hadn't said she was staying. But she hadn't mentioned leaving either. That morning, she was patching a worn flannel shirt of Holden's at the table while Lewis polished the lantern glass beside her. Letty napped curled under a quilt near the hearth. The house smelled faintly of apples and smoke. "I met a man in town today," Holden said, setting a small parcel on the counter. "Name's Ephraim Teller, runs the freight station. Said he's looking for someone to keep his books. Asked if I knew a steady hand." Grace looked up, thread paused mid-stitch. "Why would he ask you that?" "I told him about you," Holden said. "That you can read and write, keep things in order. He asked if you'd come speak with him." She set the shirt aside. "That's kind of you, but I haven't worked outside a home in years." "He don't need a banker," Holden said. "Just someone who can track crates and send notices. It's 2 days a week. I'd watch the children when I'm not riding out." Grace looked over at Lewis, who was pretending not to listen. "You do that?" "I would," Holden said. "If you want it." She pressed her fingers to the tabletop, the wood worn smooth in places. "I'll think about it." Holden nodded once, then stepped out to split kindling. Later, she walked the fence line near the west pasture, Lewis trailing along with a stick he used to tap the posts. They came upon a stretch where the barbed wire had come loose, flapping in the wind. "Should we fix it?" Lewis asked. Grace looked toward the barn, then down at her hands. "We'll tell Holden, he'll show us how." She hadn't meant to say us, but the word felt right in her mouth. That night, after the children were asleep, she stepped outside. The stars were clear, scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Holden sat on the porch, sharpening a blade by lantern light. "I'll take the job," she said. He didn't look up. "All right. I'd like to earn what we need. Not just for food, but for choices." Holden set the blade aside. "You've earned more than that." She sat down across from him. "I want to be useful again, not just needed." He leaned back, stretching his legs out. "You've been more than useful since the day you got here." Grace let the quiet settle before she said, "Owen said I wasn't enough, that I made too much of small things, that I asked too much." Holden's jaw shifted, but he didn't interrupt. "He made me believe I was the reason he stopped trying. That I was too hard to love." Holden's voice was low. "He was a coward, blamed you so he wouldn't have to carry his own shame." She looked at him then, really looked. "I don't want to be pitied." "You're not," Holden said. "You're respected." Admired. Grace folded her arms tight across her chest. "If I stay, it's not because I need protection. I never thought you did." She stood, arms still crossed. "I'm not ready for anything beyond this, not yet." He rose too, slower, his height casting a long shadow across the porch. "You don't need to be ready," he said. "I'll be here when you are." She turned to go back inside, then paused. "You ever been in love, Holden?" He considered her question for a long moment. Not the kind that lasts, not the kind that's earned. Her fingers curled against the doorframe. Then maybe we both have something to learn. The next day, Grace walked into town with Lewis, her hair braided back, her dress pressed. She met Ephraim Teller at the freight station, shook his hand, and asked questions with a steady voice. When he offered her the position, she accepted without hesitation. On their way home, Lewis tugged at her sleeve. "Does this mean we stay here?" Grace looked down at him. "It means we have something to build on." Over the following weeks, the routine shifted. Grace worked Tuesdays and Fridays. Holden kept the children busy with chores and stories about cattle drives and winter storms. Lewis started asking more questions about horses. Letty began leaving her drawings on Holden's workbench. One evening, Grace returned to find the kitchen swept, stew simmering on the stove, and Holden teaching Lewis how to tie fishing knots with a length of twine. She leaned against the doorframe, watching. "Where'd you learn that?" Holden didn't look up. "My uncle used to take me down to the Verd River. Said knots were like people, if you pull them too tight, they snap." Grace stepped inside, hanging her shawl, "And if you don't pull them tight enough, they fall apart." She met his eyes. "You ever get it right?" "Once or twice," he said. "But it takes patience." Something inside her settled. That night, after the stew was eaten and the fire banked low, Grace found Holden outside feeding the dogs. "You've given me more than I expected," she said. He scratched behind the ear of the older hound. "You've given back more." She stepped closer. "I don't know what this is yet, but it's not nothing." Holden straightened. "It's not nothing," he agreed. She didn't move when he reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. This time she didn't pull away. "Neither am I." The first frost came in the dark hours before dawn, silvering the grass and painting the barn roof with a thin glaze that cracked beneath the hen's claws come morning. Grace stepped outside with a pail and her shawl pulled tight, boots crunching across the stiff ground. The air bit at her cheeks. Winter was pressing closer. Holden was already at the corral, adjusting the rail on the south gate where one of the younger colts had kicked through the slat. He nodded when he saw her but didn't speak. They'd grown comfortable in the quiet, like that words didn't always need saying. She joined him without asking, took up a hammer and held the board steady while he nailed it flush. "You always fix things before breakfast?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the nail he drove in. "Only the ones that can't wait," he said. "Might snow before the week's out." She glanced up. "You sure?" "I've lived in this land long enough to know what it smells like when snow's coming." She brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then we ought to bring in the last of the firewood." He looked at her, gave a single nod. "I'll hitch the wagon." Grace spent the rest of the morning stacking logs in the lean-to, her arms aching by noon. Letty napped again. After lunch she'd taken to midday rest since the cold settled in, and Lewis helped Holden in the barn, brushing down the gelding and sorting nails by size just as Holden had shown him. That evening, when the work was done and the children had gone to bed with bellies full of cornmeal mush and milk, Grace lingered in the parlor. She sat in the rocker, mending a rip in her shawl while Holden tended the fire. The lamplight threw soft shadows across the floorboards. "You ever been east?" she asked, knotting the thread. "Once," he said. "Drove cattle to Missouri when I was 20, didn't much care for it. Too crowded." He stretched his legs toward the hearth. "Too many fences." She smiled faintly. "I used to think fences made a place safe." "Maybe," he said. "But they also keep things out that might have been good." Grace threaded her needle again, slower this time. "Did you ever think about leaving here, starting over somewhere else?" "I did once," he said. "Right after my brother died. Thought I'd go to California, ended up going nowhere for a long time." "What kept you?" He turned toward her. "I couldn't carry the land with me, and I didn't want to forget what we'd built." She let that settle between them. "I understand that." Holden leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "You ever miss Kansas?" "No," she said, setting her sewing in her lap. "But sometimes I miss who I thought I'd be there." He looked at her as though seeing something he hadn't before. "Who did you think you'd be?" "Someone loved without condition," she said. "Someone safe." He didn't flinch. didn't fill the silence with comfort, just sat with her in it, steady and unshaken. After a while, she said, Letty asked today if she could stay here forever. What did you tell her? I said we'd see. Holden nodded. That's fair. She stood then, folded her shawl over her arm. I'm not afraid of leaving anymore. I just don't want to run again. You're not running, he said. You're choosing. Outside, the wind picked up, and the first flakes began to fall soft as ash. The next morning, snow lay in thin sheets across the pasture, and Grace rose early to make biscuits. She worked quietly in the kitchen while Holden chopped kindling outside. She could hear his axe, rhythmic and sure, through the walls. When he came in, cheeks ruddy from the cold, she handed him a plate without a word. He sat at the table and ate slowly, eyes on her the whole time. After breakfast, she found him in the barn, checking the harnesses. She stepped inside, arms folded. I'm staying, she said. For good. Holden straightened but didn't move toward her. Because of the children? Because I want to, she said. Because there's something here that doesn't feel like survival, it feels like living. He took off his gloves, stepped closer. And do you feel safe? I do, she said. But more than that, I feel seen. He reached out then, one hand brushing hers. You are, she didn't pull away. I don't want to be courted with flowers and promises. I want a life built slow, built true. Holden's voice was quiet. Then we'll carve it together. She leaned into him, just enough that her forehead rested against his chest. His arms came around her, warm and solid, and the barn fell silent but for the hush of snow against the roof. For the first time in years, she didn't brace against the silence. She let it hold her, and him, and the space they were building piece by piece. They stood like that until the cold crept in at their boots, and the sun climbed higher over the ridge. November settled in with a kind of quiet that didn't feel empty anymore. Snow covered the pasture in shallow sheets, and the bare cottonwoods stood like old bones against the pale sky. In town, Ephraim Teller kept Grace busy tracking incoming crates of flour and coal. But the work was straightforward and honest, and she walked home with cold hands and a clear head. Holden had added a second latch to the barn door, and Lewis helped him carry water when the pump froze. Letty now followed Grace to town when weather allowed, drawing chalk horses in the dirt behind the freight station. Grace had sewn her a new wool bonnet, stitched with blue thread from a spool Teller gave her for keeping his ledgers so tidy. One evening, as Holden poured feed into the trough, Grace stepped into the barn with a folded scrap of newsprint. There's a man in Bisbee selling a cast iron stove, she said. Says it holds heat overnight. Holden shut the feed bin. You thinking of buying it? I'm thinking of a warmer kitchen, she said, but it'd take the last of what I've saved. He wiped his hands on a cloth. You'd be using it for all of us. I know, but I want to earn my share of the roof I'm sleeping under. Holden leaned against the stall gate. You don't owe me for a place to sleep, Grace. You've given more than you've taken. She held his gaze. Then let me give this too. He nodded once. We'll ride in Saturday. I'll bring the wagon. That Saturday they left the children with Mrs. O'Connor, the widow who ran the boarding house and owed Holden a favor from a year back when he'd helped dig her well deeper. The ride to Bisbee was long but clear, the sun low but bright. Grace sat beside Holden on the wagon seat, her hands tucked into her shawl. You ever think about what this land looked like before all this? She asked, watching the hills roll past. Sometimes, he said, there's still pieces of it that feel untouched, like the land's waiting to see what we make of it. I used to think I didn't belong anywhere, she said. But I'm starting to feel like the land doesn't ask for belonging. It just waits for you to stay. Holden looked over at her. You've stayed. I have. They found the stove just as described, sturdy, enamel still smooth, the firebox uncracked. Grace ran her fingers across the lid, the cold metal humming faintly beneath her skin. You want it? Holden asked. I do. He helped the seller lift it into the wagon and tied it down with the care of someone who understood what a warm kitchen could mean through a long winter. On the ride home, Grace rested her head lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, just laid his hand over hers on the bench between them. By the time they returned, the sky had turned slate and the wind carried a sharper bite. Mrs. O'Connor had fed the children and kept the stove going. Letty was curled on the rug with a book, and Louis sat at the table carving notches into a piece of pine. Grace kissed both their foreheads before turning toward the kitchen. Holden followed and helped her measure space and mark the wall where the old stove would be pulled out. They worked without speaking, shoulders brushing in the narrow space. The new stove was installed the next afternoon. Grace made corn pone on it and the crust browned like it hadn't in the old iron box. That evening, Holden lingered in the kitchen while she dried the plates. "I've been thinking," he said, "about building another room on the house, something for the children. They're growing and they'll want space of their own." Grace set the dish towel down. "You do that?" "I would. If you're here to stay, I'd like to build what you need." She stepped closer. "I'd like to build something too, not just rooms, a life." Holden reached for her hand. "Then we'll do it together." She nodded, eyes steady. "We already are." They married in early December, with Reverend Mills speaking soft words over them in the front parlor while snow fell steady outside. Letty wore a ribbon in her hair, and Louis stood proud beside Holden, the pocket of his jacket bulging with a carved wooden horse he wouldn't let go of. Grace wore a dress she'd altered herself, dyed the color of dusk with walnut husks. She didn't cry, but her eyes shone as Holden took her hands in his. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had burned low, Holden pulled her close near the hearth. She laid her head against his chest, and he rested his cheek in her hair. "This house feels different now," she whispered. "It is different," he said. "It's ours." They built the children's room before spring arrived, Holden framing the walls, Louis handing up nails, Grace measuring curtains from flour sacks she bleached in the sun. Letty painted a crooked flower on the door when no one was looking, and Grace left it there. By June, they'd planted a garden together, beans, squash, and tomatoes in careful rows. The children ran between the stalks barefoot, and Holden built a bench beneath the cottonwood that shaded the west side of the house. Grace sat there most evenings with her mending, watching the horizon stretch wide and soft. She no longer thought of Kansas, or of the letter she'd burned. There were no ghosts left in her, only a man beside her, a home built slow and honest, and a future she trusted because she'd helped shape every part of it. Holden brought her tea at dusk, and when he sat beside her, she leaned into him without hesitation. "You happy?" he asked once. She didn't answer right away, just curled her fingers around his. "I am," she said, "and I will be. Because I'm not surviving anymore, Holden, I'm living with you." And that was the truth, complete and quiet and good forever.